So how is everybody? Good? Good. Me too. Um, we're going to go over two lectures today, one on competitive research and the other on industry research. This is going to be, for those of you in my 3400 class as well, this is going to be a bit repetitive. And then, so that's today's focus. Thursday's focus is splitting up into groups again, and I'm going to give each group my feedback on what you've done so far and what I want you to do next. So that's the way this week's going to go. Any questions about that? Okay. Let me turn the screen on. There we go. Okay, so when it comes to studying competitors in this class or in my entrepreneurship class, I like to focus on developing a competitor profile. It's similar to the customer vignette, but it's focused on the competitor rather than the customer. Things to think about, things that you need to ask in the when you're putting together a customer or a competitor profile, rather. Who are the competitors, first of all? Do they vary by segment? So if you have different customer segments or different products or services that you offer, are your competitors different depending on the customer segment or the product, or are they the same? And think about substitutes as well. So, a substitute for the Roadrunner Aquatics Club, for example, might be advertising at a different venue rather than on the billboard of the McMurtry Center. So it's not really another aquatic team; it's another advertising opportunity. So remember to think about substitutes when you're thinking about your competitors as well, not just direct competitors. What do you need to know about competitors? Well, first of all, you need to know some things about the specific products and services they offer. You need to know some things about their major strengths and weaknesses, and you need to know how you plan to differentiate yourself from them. So when it comes to specific products and services, you want to know image and general impressions. You want to know something about features and benefits of their products. You want to know about the promotions that they offer. You want to know about the price point that they're selling their products at, and you want to know about what advertising media they use. So similar questions to the customer vignette, but a little bit different. Major strengths and weaknesses. A lot of times the strength that your competitors are going to have is that they have an existing customer base already. With most small businesses, new startups, your competition usually has better, more mature customer base than you do. They also often have better and more financial resources, and they may have specialization or first mover status in certain product service niches. So those are some of the major strengths to think about when you're profiling competitors. This is an example of a completed competitor profile. It's something my students in Cincinnati did a couple of years ago for a real estate venture. You can see here competitor name, customer segment, specific product or service. In this case is conventional real estate services with industrial, retail, office, and investment properties. You want to have just a brief sentence about the image that the competitor gives off. Sentence or two about the features and benefits of their products. In this case, they represent a number of different products and properties in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky. Pricing, in this case, it's 3% or 6% of the total sale or rental price, depending on whether they represent one or both sides of the deal. So that is a little bit more than normally needs to be there about pricing. Pricing could be less than a sentence, just numbers on what the prices are for your competitors' products. Advertising media, I want to know about where the competitor advertises. So in this case, it was word of mouth, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the Yellow Pages. I want to know what you think the major strengths and weaknesses of that competitor are. So in this case, the strengths were an installed base of customers, financial resources, they've been around for a while, they've got a broad range of properties, and they provide excellent customer service. So those are a lot of strengths to come up against. Weaknesses is maybe in their advertising. It's kind of reliant on word of mouth and Facebook. So how we will differentiate here at the bottom is how the venture that my students came up with was going to be different than this competitor Everest, and they plan to focus on shared services and flexible financing in order to be able to differentiate themselves. So this is what I want when you're studying competitors. I want a one-page profile of each major competitor, structured like this. When you're looking for information about competitors, there's a number of good resources. Mergent Online and ProQuest are two databases that we have access to here at CSUB that are good for doing competitor searches. Looking at the competitor's website and their social media pages is great to gather information. Just Googling them also a lot of times will pull up reviews about them, other information about the company that you wouldn't find on their website or social media. I've listed a number of links here to search tips on how to do better and more efficient Google searches. This one, for example, is kind of a basic one. Searching in your own voice, choosing your words carefully, finding quick answers. It's a good resource here for kind of crafting your searches in Google more effectively. Another one here is it's got some great tips on specific operators that you can use to narrow your searches. So if you want to search just on social media, you can put the @ symbol before the type of social media that you want to search on, and Google will search that social media for you. If you want to search on things that do not have a certain word in them, you just put a minus in front of that word when you search. Using the asterisk or quotes is also really useful. Some good tips in here for you guys. I've also listed two other tips, one from Lifehack and one from Digital Trends, that are real good on how to improve your Google searches. ProQuest. It's, like I said before, a good resource for searching on competitors. There's a narrow results by window in there on the right-hand side of the search results page that's useful to use for narrowing your search results. Chambers of commerce and industry associations are great sources of information for finding more information about competitors. And finally, just asking around, word of mouth. Word of mouth can pull up a lot of information for you on your competitors. And kind of like with customer outreach, record everything you can. No piece of information is too small. So that is what I wanted to say about competitor profiles. Now I want to talk a little bit about market positioning maps and comparing your competitors to comparing yourself to other competitors graphically. Many of you in your marketing classes may have had some exposure to market positioning maps. It's one of the most common ways of comparing competitors in an industry. The most important thing with competitive positioning maps or market positioning maps is that you need differentiable, non-obvious X and Y axes. So some of the common criteria that you use for the X and Y axes are price and quality on the same axis, product selection or product features, distribution network, resource bases, business model, or things that make you go, things that are interesting in some way or another about your company or about the competition. Those are also good to use for your axes. This is an example of a market positioning map that those same students back in Cincinnati did for their company. Impact was the name of their company. In their case, they decided to look at breadth of services on one axis and types of properties represented on another axis. And their company basically offered some value-added services to clients, but they only represented one kind of industrial real estate. So they're on the far left-hand side of the x-axis and kind of halfway up the y-axis. Compared to that, other competitors that they had, Cushman and Wakefield had a similar service offering, but represented a little bit more variety of properties. Everest, the competitor that we saw the profile for, and CBRE had less of a service offering, but even more broad of a range of properties than Impact and Cushman. And then finally, Coldwell Banker and Colliers International represented a lot of properties, and they also had a lot of services that they offered. So, one way to differentiate the competitors from each other. It's important when you write up a market positioning map to write up along with it your justification and assumptions that you made for putting the competitors on the map. So in this case, this team listed what their company offered, then listed what the competition offered, and then down here at the bottom explained how they decided where to put people on that y-axis. In this case, it was brokerages that offered more services outside of just representing clients were placed higher on the y-axis. Same thing they did for the x-axis, what their company offered, what competitors offered, and why they placed the competitors the way they did on the map. That is basically all I wanted to say about competitors. I'm going to move on now to industry research, and then we'll wrap up after that. It's going to be kind of a quick class today. I don't think it's going to run the whole period. So coming back here, industry research. There we go. So there's two different levels of analysis when we're talking about industry research. There's the macro environment and the environment within a certain industry at a certain time. So the macro environment is characterized by big picture trends and changes, such as changes in technology, changes in economic conditions, different legislation and regulations that come from the government, shifting demographics of the population, and changes in societal values and lifestyles over time. These are big picture issues to think about. Where is your market? Where is your industry going in the future? In the inside of this circle, we've got 5 forces. It's called Porter's 5 forces that sort of determine the description of an industry at a given point in time. Suppliers, buyers, substitutes, new entrants, and rival firms. We'll talk about each of those a little bit here in an upcoming slide. But this is the overview of how I want you to see the market environment of your businesses. Driving forces. These macro environmental forces on the outside of the circle. When you're considering which ones are more and less important, you want to think about the impact that they have on industry attractiveness. So, are the driving forces going to make demand for the product go up or go down? Are they going to make competition more or less intense? And are they going to lead to higher or lower profitability for the industry? You want to ask yourself those 3 questions when assessing the importance of big picture drivers of change like technology and population demographics and things like that. And then once you've determined what those big picture issues are that are important for your industry, you want to determine what strategic changes are necessary for your company in order to be able to prepare for the impact of those driving forces. Information sources for Porter's 5 for driving forces. I've listed those same Google links here. Google is also a good source of information for driving forces. Industry associations, and then I've listed here First Research Industry Profiles. This is a database that we have access to at our library. If we search on the name of any industry or the code number of that industry, so if I want to type in banking, for example, investment banking, banks and credit unions, there's all of these reports that we have access to through our library that have a really good overview of different industries. So whichever industry your business is focused in, let me go use a better example. Bakeries. So bakeries, quarterly update, 2013 is not that old. So we got bakery product manufacturing here. So this is manufacturing of breads and cakes and things like that. Everything you wanted to know about that industry, especially if you scroll down about, I don't know, third to a half of the way down the report. There's some sections on business challenges, business trends, industry opportunities. All of these things are great examples of driving forces of change in the industries that you're that you're focused on, written up by experts on Wall Street. So these are really nice, useful reports to kind of flesh out your knowledge of the what big picture changes and trends are affecting the future of your industry. So that is the resource that you use to find driving forces information. Now to talk briefly about Porter's 5 forces. In any given industry at any point in time, these 5 forces are either high, medium, or low, each of the 5 of them. And depending on whether they're high, medium, or low, determines the relative attractiveness of that market compared to other markets. So buyer power, for example, it's based more than anything on how many buyers there are and how high or low the switching costs are for switching between competitors. So in the example, if you look at the example of cell phones, there's a lot of buyers, but it's a little bit inconvenient to switch from an iPhone platform to a Droid platform or vice versa. So buyer power is kind of intermediate in that industry. Medium, not high, not low. Supplier power, the same question you're asking, but instead of asking it about buyers or the end customers of your company, you're asking it about the suppliers to your company. So how many suppliers are there for your company, and what are the switching costs for your company to switch from one supplier to another? If they're high, then it's going to be less power for the if the switching costs are high, it's going to be less power for the buyer. If switching costs are low, it's going to be more power for the buyer. So I take that back. In buyer power, switching costs being sort of high and there being a lot of buyers, there's very low buyer power in the cell phone market. It's not medium, it's low. Supplier power, this is like, if we use the cell phone example again, this is like the providers of silicon chips, the providers of the glass screens, providers of the raw materials that go in to make the product up. The question is, how many of them are there, and what are the switching costs to switch between competitors there? The threat of new entrants. This is basically a question about how hard is it to get into the market in the first place, and how attractive is the market to get into. So, first of all, does it cost a lot of money to get into the industry? If it does, there's a higher barrier to entry. If it's cheap to get into the industry, there's a low barrier to entry. You also want to think about, however, whether there's any space left in the industry to compete. Sometimes the barriers to entry are really low, but that means that there's a lot of companies that have already gotten into that industry, and you don't want to get into it too because it's already full of competitors and not very attractive. So it's both the cost of getting into the industry as well as the relative attractiveness of how many competitors there are in the industry. Threat of substitutes. So you want to ask yourself if the same customer needs can be satisfied another way. I had the example before of Roadrunner Aquatics and other advertising opportunities rather than other swim clubs per se. You always want to ask yourself, are there substitute products, and if so, how strong is the appeal of those substitute products? And then finally, rivalry among firms. First of all, you're asking yourself how many competitors there are. If there's a lot of competitors, rivalry tends to be high. If there's a low number of competitors, rivalry tends to be low. However, even if there's a small number of competitors, you also want to ask yourself how devoted those competitors are to competing with each other. So in the search engine market, for example, Google and Bing are pretty much the only two games in town, and Google's got the lion's share of the market for themselves. Google and Bing could just agree with each other. Look, Google will stay with 80% of the market. Bing, you can have 20%. We won't do anything to compete with each other, and we'll raise prices. They could agree to that. There's only two companies. They've got a lot of power to do that. But Google and Bing hate each other. Or Google and Microsoft hate each other. So they're constantly trying to tear the other one down, even though there's only two competitors in the industry. A contrary example to that is OPEC. So the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There's only certain countries in the world that have oil reserves, and there's not that many of them. So if they all agree to set the price of oil at a certain price, then the rest of the world has to deal with that, and there's nothing they can do about it. So right now we're in a period where there's not a lot of collusion between the oil-producing countries, and the supply of oil is really high, price is really low. At other times, when those countries get together and agree on prices and agree on a supply level, then they can artificially raise the price compared to what fierce competition would be. Information sources for Porter's Five Forces. There's Business Source Premier in particular that I like to use. And then industry associations in Google, just like with driving forces. If you click on this link to Business Source Premier here, you will get to the wrong page. So we got to go to the library's website. And go to the database list and databases by title. And then we're looking for a database called Business Source Premier. So we click on the letter B. And down at the bottom there is Business Source Premier. On the right-hand side of Business Source Premier, there's industry profiles, company profiles, market research reports. If you click on industry profiles, this gives all kinds of different profiles of industries, just like that first research industry profiles did. These are different reports that have different information in them, though. So, for example, if we look here at software industry profile, United States. So if we open that up and click on where it says full text and PDF full text, if you scroll down, there's two different types of reports in this database, ones that have a white cover and ones that have a blue cover. The ones that have a blue cover are the ones that you're looking for Porter's Five Forces information. If you scroll down a little bit here in the table of contents, you'll see Five Forces analysis. If we skip to page 12, you'll see here there's an overall description of Porter's Five Forces, and then there's a page describing each of those forces. So buyer power here, supplier power, new entrants, threat of substitutes, degree of rivalry. They give you a description of each of the five. So depending on what industry you're in, you can go to this database, type in the name of the industry, and get a great idea from Wall Street professionals again about what is the structure of your industry. What are those 5 forces for your particular industry that you're in? In addition to that database, like I said, there's also industry associations in Google. Important thing when it comes to industry research is the important lesson here is that we've got great databases that we've got access to here at Cal State, and I encourage you to use them to broaden your perspective on the industry that your business is in. A lot of times small business owners, small business employees get so busy in the day-to-day work of the business that they forget to think about big picture trends in the future and what's going to happen a year or 2 years or 5 years from now. And it's an unfortunate weakness of small business owners. It's important to keep your perspective, to keep yourself in touch with the trends and structure of your industry by reading reports like this. So it's only 5 after 6, but that actually is all I wanted to go over for today. So if you guys, does anybody have any questions on what I went over? It's pretty straightforward. That's it for today. On Thursday, we're going to break up into groups again, and I'm going to give you each my feedback on next steps. And that'll be this week. See you on Thursday. Okay.